After I retired from paid employment, one of my goals was to write up a family history of my three great-grandparent family groups. I started off working on the gentleman there in the centre left. That's Fred Collins. This is my Collins family group. It was quite interesting. He was a pastoralist and a farmer in central Queensland and a stock inspector, but I soon became intrigued with the chap up there on the top left, Captain Thomas Collins. We had in our family history heard lots about him. He was a bit of a hero, I guess. He was a master mariner, a whaler, sea captain, made a fortune, lost a fortune as well. So I then concentrated on him and have finished with a rather large publication which is out here on the desk. It's a 430-page compilation, A4 size, dealing with him and some of his ancestors, going right back to his grandparents and then following through to the younger generations as well. I think there are several hundred images in that publication. This is the cover for the book, which you're welcome to look at during the coffee break. And this is the gentleman himself. It's the only known photograph that we have of him. We suspect it was taken in 1855. It's one of the original daguerreotype images and was almost certainly taken in Brisbane when he was about 65 years old. Tom Collins was born in the little village of Road in eastern Somerset, not far from the well-known city of Bath and therefore not far from Bristol. Road is right on the eastern margin of Somerset, and in fact the border with Wiltshire goes right through the middle of town. So Road is actually located on the Frome River, which is a quite fast-flowing river, and along that river, about every 3 or 4 kilometres, in the 17th and 18th century, there was a woolen mill. So there were a couple of woolen mills near Road, and the Collins family and their ancestors were all involved in the woolen industry, producing woolen fabric, and there would be associated dye factories where they would colour the wool before it was shipped off to London for sale. This is where he was born, at a building called Rockabella. Rockabella is on the Frome River, and there was a woolen mill located here. Tom's grandparents were very wealthy, very successful wool producers, and this particular grandparent was named Node, Jonathan Node, and he was responsible for building several mansions in the village of Road for each of his sons. So this is one of them, and the next slide shows another one as well. Now, we're not quite sure why he didn't pursue the woolen industry himself. There are possibly a couple of reasons for that. One is that there was a general decline in the woolen industry in Somerset at this stage, and most of the manufacturing was moving north up to Yorkshire, where there was more reliable steam-operated power, and so Somerset woolen industry was on the decline. He might have been aware of that. His father, James Collins, was a wool dyer and had a royal patent for the colour purple. And I understand purple was quite a difficult dye colour to get, and it was much appreciated by the aristocracy and royalty in England. Now, he died when Tom Collins was quite young. He was only 4 years old, and we don't know how he died, but it may have been related to some problem within the woolen industry. The other factor to consider is this is the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and from 1793 to 1815, and Nelson had just performed at Trafalgar in 1805 when Tom was a 15-year-old lad, and I suspect there'd be many a young English lad who would have been quite enthusiastic about this and quite keen to join the Royal Navy. We've lost track of Thomas for a few years now. We don't come up with him again until 1813. We find that he was, in 1813, he turns up as being the second mate on a ship called the Three Bs. Now, the Three Bs is quite a famous ship. A lot is known about it. Been a PhD thesis written on this by a chap called Bill Archbold. Bill is a Catholic priest living in Sydney, and one of his great-great-great-grandfathers was a convict on the 3Bs, and Bill went about researching this for his PhD thesis. The 3Bs was built as a convict transport ship, and on board the ship there's 219 convicts. There was a military detachment of 45 men to look after the convicts, Captain John Wallace, and then second mate, Thomas Collins. So the 3Bs went over to Ireland, picked up all the Irish male convicts, and it was accompanied by another convict ship called the Caroline, and those two ships were then accompanied by two Royal Navy ships, and the four ships then proceeded down to South America, to Rio de Janeiro, and then onwards to Australia. But the trip wasn't without incident. When they got off the coast of West Africa, they came across a French 44-gun battleship called the Ceres. And so the two British ships engaged the Ceres in a battle and were successful in dismasting the Ceres and capturing the captain of the French ship, whose name was Baron de Bougainville. And this was that ship's maiden voyage, so not a very pleasant start to its history. Now, right in the very, very background, on the far right of that image, the other two convict ships. You really can't see them there, but Tom Collins would have certainly witnessed this battle with the French ship en route. The ship was taken back to England and rebadged as the ship the Seine in the British Navy. So the 3Bs proceeded on to Port Jackson, arriving there in 1814, and after the convicts were taken off and the cargo discharged, the Sydney-siders found or noticed that there was some smoke emanating from the ship, and unfortunately the ship was on fire, and it actually proceeded and burnt right down to the water's edge. So the 3Bs had a very short history, starting off in 1813 and finishing off in 1814. Now, we don't know how Tom got back to England, but he must have got back somehow, because he reappears on the scene in 1820. In 1820 on a ship called the Duchess of York. The Duchess of York was a ship which he commanded. He went to Hobart Town first and then afterwards to Port Jackson. It was a general merchandise ship carrying freight from England to Australia, together with lots of free immigrants. The next time we come across him is with another ship. He was a commander of the ship called the Regalia. The Regalia was, again, a general merchandise ship. 70 immigrants, free immigrants, coming out to Australia. There are no more convicts on his ships. It's an interesting trip because he actually took a contract to go down to Macquarie Island. Macquarie Island actually only having been discovered about 10 years prior to that. So he was actually going down into relatively uncharted waters, and there he picked up a consignment of elephant seal oil, amounting to about 270 tonnes of the stuff. And together with the Sydney gangs that produced the oil, he brought them back to Port Jackson. Now, the next ship that he was commander of is called the Elizabeth, and I'll say a little bit more about this ship because it features quite prominently in his ongoing work in England and Australia. The ship was owned by a gentleman called Robert Brooks, and Brooks was an eminent businessman and a seafaring man operating between England and Australia from the 1820s up through to about the 1870s. There's been a lot of research done on Robert Brooks, and it's been published in a book which I've got here, written actually by Frank Bracey, who was Associate Professor of History at UWA. So this is, I found a fascinating book because also it's got several references in it to his association with Thomas Collins. What they were doing was, as well as arranging for freight to go from England to Australia for various agents, they were involved in what he called his adventure operation. And the adventure operation was where they bought products of their own on their own behalf and shipped them down to Australia and then sold them on their own behalf as well. So they were making money on the side, as well as receiving the funds from the agents who were paying to have their freight transported to Australia. On this particular trip, it was always the captain's duty to dispose of the cargo to the various agents and look around for additional cargo. And one of the contracts that Tom Collins got there in Port Jackson was to take a military detachment from Port Jackson down to Hobart Town, about 45 men I think it was, and likewise then to bring the Tasmanian military consignment back up to Port Jackson. He had trouble getting freight on that return trip to England, but eventually managed to get a contract to transport coal to Batavia, with the old name for Jakarta. It's the first time I realised that New South Wales was producing coal at that time, but apparently it was. After Batavia, he moved on to Singapore, and at Singapore he was able to get a full cargo and ship it back to England. Now, by this time, Thomas is 36 years old, and he must have been thinking about getting married, and he eventually married this lovely young lady, Sophia Pamela Danvers. Danvers was quite a famous English name, originally French, but Sophia was a beautiful young lady, and she's also known as the Belle of Bath. So they were married, and there's quite a lot written about Sophia. There's a book that I came across recently called Certain Worthy Women. It was written by one of Thomas's granddaughters, Marie Irvine, and I've got a copy of it here on the desk if anyone's interested in looking at it. And Marie is writing the story of about 24 worthy women in Australian early history, pioneering people. And the article on Sophia is called Mrs. Thomas Collins of Telemon. Soon after their honeymoon, they loaded up the Elizabeth with freight and organised with Brooks another adventure, joint venture, and off they went to Australia. And on this particular trip, he went direct to Port Jackson. All of his previous trips and most of the trips by the early sailors stopped at Hobart Town and then moved up to Port Jackson afterwards. But during this period, the Tasmanian authorities had instituted a tax on all people leaving the port on the Derwent River. And that charge was half a crown, or 2 and 6, 2 shillings and sixpence. And Thomas is recorded as saying that he would never, ever stop at Hobart Town whilst that tax was still imposed. And he was true to his word. So he went all the way up to Port Jackson direct and left out the trip to Hobart. At this time, it was boom time in New South Wales, and there's lots of evidence of the wealth that was being produced there. I've got there an item on Mrs. Bodeman's jewellery. He brought out a consignment of beautiful gold and silver and turquoise amethyst jewellery, which Mrs. Bodeman was advertising in the local Sydney Gazette as having been brought out by Captain Collins for sale to interested people in Sydney. During this excursion, he got a contract to go out to the Isle of France, now known as Mauritius, to get a load of sugar. So he and Sophia and her servant, Sophia, because she was very pregnant at this stage, went out to Mauritius. They picked up a load of sugar and wine and 4 Timor ponies and Captain Vine and an escaped prisoner. And they all came back to Sydney. Now, whilst this was going on, the local agents in Sydney were advertising that the ship Elizabeth was being prepared to accept wool for shipment to England. And so that's what happened. And there was an advertisement in the paper at that time saying that this was the first woolen ship sailing direct to England from Sydney. So on board that ship there were 746 bales of wool and 98 bales of flax, together with a huge amount of red cedar timber, very much valued timber at that time, having been sourced from northern New South Wales and southern Queensland. But in addition to that, he was carrying £50,000 in cash back to England. And by my crude calculations, that's equivalent to about somewhere between 5 and 10 million current Australian dollars. So there's a lot of money going back to England from the produce in Australia. One other item of interest there was Sophia had her first baby in Sydney on this particular trip. Unfortunately, the baby died, baby Francis. Yeah, okay. So in 1829, the family decided that they would come to Sydney to live for good, and they came out in the Elizabeth again. And I guess this trip is most noted for the birth of Carden Collins, James Carden Collins, who's my great-great-grandfather. He was born in Trinidad en route to Australia. So this is the second trip to Australia by Sophia. It's Tom's sixth voyage to Australia, and the third time that we know of the Elizabeth. There was a previous trip by the Elizabeth under Robert Brooks's command before Thomas's trip to Australia. So notice in the paper at the time said that on board the ship there was proper furniture to embark on the sperm fishery trade with this fine ship. They referred to whaling in those days as fishing. It was they talked about the sperm fishery being the area in the Pacific where the sperm whales were being slaughtered. Okay, just briefly a bit of history about whaling itself at that time. What happened was that the sailing ships would go out to look for whales. When they found a whale, they would lower the whaleboats and row out to the whale, and the harpooners would harpoon the poor animal. The animal would be then attached to the side of the boat, and the men would flense the whale, obtain the blubber, and the blubber would be hauled up onto the deck, and there it was boiled down into oil in what they called tripots. T-R-Y, tripots were used to produce the oil. And then, of course, the oil would be put into barrels, and sometime later the barrels would be stowed away in the lower holds of the boat. So it was a dangerous occupation. As far as I can make out, none of Captain Thomas Collins's crew were ever injured, although there were some close shaves. This is a summary of that particular journal of voyage. The thing that surprised me was the length of the voyage. The voyage was 541 days. Now that's 18 months. He's 18 months out at sea, not returning to Sydney. He certainly would have returned to various other locations to restock and so on. But these are very long journeys. They weren't just, a fortnight's trip out from Sydney Harbour and back again with a few whales. Very, very long trips. And on this particular trip, he came back with 360 tonnes of oil. So I'll say more about that later. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about Tom's journal. Tom actually kept a daily journal, and I've got a few comments here that he wrote in his journal, which you might find interesting. Okay, on March the 11th, this would be in 1830, he says that the wind was to westward and blowing hard, running away to New Zealand and going on to Japan. He was actually going to New Zealand to get rid of a couple of his crew and to pick up some new crew, and he had decided that he was going to go off to Japan. So he was proceeding from here, north, across the equator. He stopped at Nauru en route and other Pacific islands and went up to off the coast of Japan for whaling before he returned. And another entry, April the 3rd. Men employed killing pigs to salt down for sea diet. I have almost 50 slain and have destroyed about another 20. We left 20 since we left from port. I also have 450 bushels of potatoes. I've forgotten my high school amounts, but I'm not sure what a bushel is now, but it sounds like an awful lot of potatoes anyway. 450 bushels of potatoes. But some of these boats were virtually floating farmyards. There were he always had pigs which he would have to feed, look after, and they had piglets, and he'd slaughter these and salt them down. And also they had lots of chickens as well. So there were times when the ship was in the doldrums, when there was no wind blowing, no whales to be seen. So all the men there, including the captain, had to spend most of their time just doing repairs to sails and feeding the pigs and the chooks. April the 4th, saw in the afternoon at 4, I saw some whales and succeeded in getting a really good one, which will make us about 65 barrels of oil. All hands quite themselves again. So I envisaged from that there were times when the men were wishing for some action and unfortunately they couldn't get it. So I was surprised to find out how much oil one whale would produce. 65 barrels, had to be about 5 or 6 tons of oil. You'll have to excuse me for reading slowly because I'm slightly vision impaired and I have trouble reading this. April the 5th, fine weather, cut up our whale and moving it to the tripods. So he's boiling them down now to make the oil. And then he talks about on April the 19th, the pain in my side has been very bad lately, but I am taking my blue pills. Now, I did a bit of research on blue pills, and blue pills was apparently quite a common medication in those days for all sorts of ailments. And I was surprised, though, to find that the composition of blue pills, it contains about 33% mercury. I don't know what that did to his health, but it doesn't sound like it would be very good. One last one, April the 20th, busy stowing away barrels of oil in the lower holds. The sameness of one of these voyages is most dreadful, he says, but we must be contented. I am much better for taking the blue pills, and I am now off all kinds of wine and spirits. I'll just say a word or two about the financing of these voyages. All the crew, including the captain, enter into contracts with the ship owners, and they're all paid a fraction of the net proceeds of the sale of the oil. So up there you see the captain receives between 1/8 and 1/10 of the net proceeds. The able-bodied seaman will get about 1/100th of the net proceeds, and going right down to the green hands and the boys, they would get, say, from 1/160th to 1/200th of the net proceeds of the voyage. And the expenses there include, of course, food and water, various supplies, pilotage, wharfage, insurance, and all of that. And from that you can calculate what the net proceeds of the trip were. Now I was just staggered when I saw how rich that 360 tonnes of oil was. I calculated roughly what I thought this would be in current Australian dollars, and it amounts to about $30 million Australian. So Tom Collins would have received probably about the equivalent of $3 million for that 18 months that he was out on the waves. And there's no question that he became a very wealthy man just on that one trip. But in addition to that, by this stage he was a 1/4 owner of the ship Elizabeth. He had purchased a quarter of the ship from Robert Brooks. So he would also be receiving funds from his interest in the ship as well. This picture just shows you roughly what would have happened when the ship came into harbour. We can just pretend that ship is the Elizabeth and in Sydney Harbour. All the barrels would be offloaded from the ship and they were all gauged. In other words, somebody would be measuring the barrels to make sure they were full of oil, and then when everybody was satisfied, the barrels would be unloaded into another ship and shipped off to England for sale. Just briefly, a few points in the period from 1829 up to 1837. This is when Tom and Sophia lived in Sydney. They lived in Leichhardt, a suburb of Leichhardt. Sophia had 5 more children, 2 of who died. In fact, the first 2 died. So of the first 4 children that she ever had, 3 of them had died. But anyway, the others survived, and so they ended up with two girls and 2 boys living in Sydney. By this time, Thomas was no longer whaling. I think that first trip had been enough for him. But the ship Elizabeth was still contracted out, and there were 4 more voyages with that ship with a different captain, Captain Fowler. But no doubt Thomas would have been profiting also because of his 1/4 interest in the ship. So eventually the Collins family decided to go back to England. I don't know quite why. Their elderly parents were not well, so they may have gone back for that reason. And Carden was destined to join the Royal Navy. He'd need to have a proper English naval education. So he commanded the ship Elizabeth, and back they went to England. We have something strange here happened. Thomas actually then, after a short period, he came back to Australia by himself, leaving Sophia and the children in Road in Somerset. He came back by himself, but only stayed 11 months before he returned back to England again. On that trip out to Australia again, he was in a ship captained by Robert Towns. Now this is a gentleman who Townsville, the city in Queensland, is named after. Robert Towns was a sea captain and a prominent merchant in Sydney, and he was good mates with Tom Collins. Now the next time we hear of Thomas, he's back in Sydney again with a shipload of oil. So he made an arrangement with Robert Brooks, and he came out in the ship called the Arabian. It's a smaller ship, 270 odd tonnes, and he just suddenly appeared in Sydney Harbour with a load of oil. It was a long voyage. I'm not sure how long actually the whaling component was, but he would have sailed from England out to Australia and then conducted his whaling activities and ended up with 60 tonnes of oil. But you notice it's a fairly long whaling journal, I think about between 3 and 350 days. This is a drawing, or a painting rather, of the Arabian, which was done by one of his granddaughters, Kate Elizabeth Knott. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but it's one that's in the family archives. This is a summary of the next journey that he did. He went out again sailing, looking for whales. No, sorry, this is the second whaling trip summary. Now, after his third trip, he found that he had virtually lost all of his fortune. It was tough times in New South Wales. In fact, it was tough times all around the world. But he was only in harbour about 2 days, and he wrote a very long, lengthy letter to his wife Sophia in England, explaining that he had virtually lost his fortune, presumably through poor investments by maybe himself and his agents, but that he still had some land left in New South Wales and in Queensland. But basically he said that he was ruined, He had £2,000 left, which probably wasn't too bad a sum of money in those days. He implored Sophia to go and visit Robert Brooks and seek his advice. He talked about all the people in Sydney who are now destitute. He talks about the Commonwealth Bank, the New Australian Bank, 3 insurance companies, all ruined, all destitute. And previously, when there had been hundreds of carriages on the ships on the streets of Sydney, there were none to be seen at this stage. So things must have been pretty bad in Sydney. This is in 1844. So he left it with her, to Sophia, to make decisions as to what to do. But she did go and see Robert Brooks. She arranged with him to come back to Australia with her 6 children. She had 2 more children in England, so the 4 that were born in Australia plus the 2 in England. And they came out in a ship called the Angelina, which was not an incident-free trip either. They had trouble. The ship was dismasted in a storm as they approached Cape Town. They had to go into Cape Town, spent 5 weeks there searching for a new mast. Eventually, though, they got to Port Jackson and were looked after by Captain Robert Towns, because at this stage Thomas was still out whaling. So he didn't return to Sydney for another 7 months. So she would have been there with her 6 children, waiting to hear from her husband, who was still out on the high seas. So he eventually came back, and that last sailing trip, his 4th one, lasted 773 days. So a huge amount of time, and only returned 80 tonnes of oil. So the writing was on the wall. Whaling was not the business to be in anymore. Presumably the number of whales was decreasing, so they had to work a lot longer on the high seas to get a less amount of oil. And so to Queensland, just to finish off. Thomas had purchased 3 lots of land. Coolmunda is a big property on the Darling Downs, the southern part of the Darling Downs, and also south of Brisbane, Telemon and Melcombe. Melcombe, which was later named Mount Maroon. They are quite substantial properties. This is a view of Telemon station as it is today, with Sophia's headstone there in the front garden on the right hand side. She died in 1863. The Collins family were at Telemon for about 15 years. Quite a big property. At one stage they had about 45 people living there. It was on the mail route from Brisbane to Casino, and a beautiful property which extended all the way down almost to what is now the Queensland-New South Wales border on the McPherson Ranges. So after Sophia died, Captain Collins went up to this property here called Nindooinbah. Nindooinbah is a beautiful heritage building near Bow Desert, constructed mostly of red cedar. It's a lovely building. And that was owned by Thomas's son-in-law, a fellow called Alfred Campini, who married Jessie Collins, one of Thomas's daughters. This is a picture of Jessie Campini. And this is Alfred Campini. Alfred was actually a member of the first Queensland Legislative Assembly, which was formed in 1859. But sadly, Thomas was not well. He died at Nindooinbah and is buried on the hillside behind the homestead, which you can see in the next picture. The next slide shows the headstone. There's a little headstone there up the side of the hill. We're not sure whether this is where he's actually buried or whether it was conveniently moved here later on. But the memorial is there for Thomas Collins and his wife Sophia, although Sophia died at Telemon, which was a little bit further south. And that's the story of Captain Thomas Collins. So So if you've got time, I can take some questions if there are any. Question at the back?
Did he come to Western Australia?
No, he didn't come to the West at all. He's concentrated on New South Wales and Queensland. I don't think he was even ever went to Victoria, unless he went there for supplies. But as far as I know, just New South Wales and Queensland.
Are the 3 properties still in the Collins family, or have they all gone?
No, the 3 properties are gone. Coolmunda was actually sold in about 1850. Thomas took over Telemon in about 1848. They were there for 15 years, and then the property was sold. And the other property, Mount Maroon, was actually managed by Thomas's eldest son, Carden, and he made a mess of it actually, and ended up bankrupt. And so that was taken over by the bank in about 1855, I think it was. So unfortunately, there was no money to be passed on to the to the younger generations.
One more.
Yep.
I was interested in the length of time that these voyages took when they were whaling, up to 2 years. What did the crew of perhaps a couple of hundred eat during that time? They couldn't possibly have taken ship's biscuits and water, so presumably they ate a lot of fish.
Well, there's no reference to them catching fish, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did. But it's sort of, I got the impression they ate salt pig and potatoes most of the time. It's not a very good diet, but they did stop off at various places to get supplies. I shouldn't say they were on the sea all that time. They did drop into. There's some reference there to dropping into some of the Pacific Islands en route up to Japan, and mixing with the natives and enjoying their company for a while, and resupplying the ship with goods, presumably vegetables and fruit as well.
I don't know if we've arranged for somebody to thank Morland, but I'll do it to save a bit of time. Morland, that was quite fantastic, the detail you went into. You must have spent hours and hours and months and weeks
yes.
and years. And so I hope you'd all like to join me in expressing our thanks by applause.